Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Podcast 83, the only podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties. We have our full legislative staff here today for an update on what's been happening the past week here in Lansing. We've all got our good, nice microphones on. We've rested from St. Patrick's Day and a big Spartan weekend, and I think Michigan played as well, but I think they had an NIT loss. But Spartans, couple wins, Sweet 16, they're dancing. The dancing's going on. Oh, Deena, I don't think we asked anyone to dance in the future. Please refrain from dancing. Kind of reminds me.
I was standing up doing it too. You couldn't even see that, could you?
Kind of reminds me. Remember that Seinfeld episode when Eileen's dancing? I'm sure Samantha and Madeline don't, but
Elaine,
her, yeah.
I know.
That kind of reminds me of what Deena was just doing there for those that are listening to the podcast today. All right.
I don't think that's very nice.
Let's get started. A couple things, we had a fairly busy legislative week last week, but there are some things that we're working on that have been ongoing for a long period of time. And first up, Samantha, we're going to start with you. Talk to us a little bit about where we are with juvenile justice facilities. We know it's a statewide issue, Southeast Michigan, Northern Michigan, a lot going on. Why don't you kind of tell us where we've been, bring us up to speed a little bit, and we'll go from there.
Happily. So yeah, we've got a few counties working to request juvenile justice facilities and funding from the State Department of Health and Human Services. No concrete details on that yet, still kind of hashing that out. But on the topic of juvenile justice, aside from facilities and funding, the Juvenile Justice Task Force provided its recommendations last July. Myself and other stakeholders have been working on a bill package to be introduced, I think, in the next month or so. Our initial goal was spring break, but we had some language concerns to work through. But based on the recommendations from the task force, there are 32 of them. We identified a set of top tier priorities. There's 6 of them. Those 6 are going to be, it's looking like 15 bills. So it's a very large package. The one of highest concern for counties is that child care fund expansion, increasing the reimbursement rate from 50 to 75%, which was included in the governor's budget recommendation. So we're thrilled about that. That's more than likely to get done. The child care fund, we're looking at expansions for diversion eligibility, risk screening, and mental health tool assessments. So all good things there. Other priorities, expanding the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission to include juvenile defense standards as well, a juvenile system within the State Appellate Defender's Office, the removal of fines and fees, which we're working on language to make sure that counties aren't going to have to backfill that cost, that the state will fund courts once they can't levy those fines and fees in juvenile cases.
Real quick, Sam, just to interject real quick. Sorry to interrupt you, but I did have a quick question on the state appellate indigent defense juvenile side of things. Is that something that is paid for by counties now that we're asking the state to now take over? Or is that something that individuals are paying for? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So currently, my understanding of it is that the fines and fees that are paid to the courts in juvenile cases, in addition to the child care fund, is used towards those necessary services that are provided.
Okay.
Now they'll be expanding MIDC, which the state, disperses back to counties through grants to include juveniles. And as far as SATO goes, they didn't have a juvenile office within their prior. It was at the local court level. So now SATO will have juvenile oversight, but local discretion will be maintained.
But if they're going to do the Indigent Defense Commission, are they talking about then expanded recommendations for how these juveniles are defended and, sort of expanding those services? Is that why we're thinking that MIDC should pick up the cost for not only the lack of fines and fees, but additional services? Is that the conversation?
Not quite. I mean, the language right now, the bill draft that we have literally takes the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission Act and just drops juvenile in, adults and juveniles all throughout the bill, which the funding then would extend to juveniles. As far as the services go, I mean, the indigent defense, yes, will come from the MIDC grants, the other juvenile services that are provided, the child care fund. The handbook is being rewritten, as well as language in that bill to expand services for juveniles. So the state will reimburse for additional services than they were initially reimbursing for.
Got it. Got it.
And that increase from 50 to 75%, that's something we've advocated for a long time, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Currently, there's two reimbursement rates. One's 50%. That's for the juvenile population under 17. And then after raise the age legislation, the 17-year-old population, the state reimburses at 100%, but there's a sunset date in 2025 on that. So it's really combining the 50 and 100% reimbursement rate for two populations down to 175 reimbursement across the board.
Okay, great. All right, thanks, Sam. Any other questions from anyone on that? All right.
It's complicated, but I'm glad you're working on it.
Yeah.
It sounds like a whole juvenile system overhaul. It is really what it sounds
is.
like. But after they did the whole raise the age thing and dumped that, larger population back in there, I think it was, overdue. So
Yeah,
good
Yep.
work.
it is complete reform and overhaul of the system. So it's a lot of work, but I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts there. All right, moving on. Madeline, be honest with you, when we were talking about this for our podcast prep and I heard materials management, I didn't really know what we were going to be talking about. And I didn't want to ask you then because I knew you were going to explain it to us now. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about materials management?
Yeah, so late last term, there was a big bill package that got signed into law, updating all of the materials management plans in the state of Michigan. And that means a lot of work for counties. And next week, March 29th, marks the official beginning of that plan approval process.
Materials management, as in formerly known as solid waste and recycling.
Yes, it
Okay,
was
thank you.
Part 115, formerly solid waste. They're now referring to it as materials management planning. So beginning March 29th, which is next Wednesday, each county board of commissioners will have 180 days to file a notice of intent with the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. So they will have until about the end of September to decide whether or not they want control of their new materials management plan or if they want to turn the responsibility over to Eagle. Eagle will make the plan for the county if they decline to do so. Right now, it seems like Eagle's really encouraging regional planning and inter-county planning. So this 180-day window will allow counties to collaborate and decide whether or not they want to work together and file together. After that 180 days, so end of September, everyone will have 36 months total to create their plans and get approval from Eagle. So 3 years. That brings us to fall of 2026, which seems like, a long period of time, but there's a lot of work to be done in that 36-month period.
Yeah, as far as I understand, there's lots of recycling requirements and goals that they need to meet, locals they have to engage with, right?
Mhm.
But there's money
Yep.
attached to it too, isn't there?
There is money attached to it. And I don't have that number in front of me right now, but there is a grant program. Every county will receive X amount of dollars. And if you decide to collaborate, there is additional funding. So they're really trying to incentivize this regional planning. But the department hosts monthly webinars, and they've encouraged, and we are also encouraging every county to have someone on those webinars to learn more. They're really walking everyone through the process step by step. They're very detailed. The next one is April 19th. They're the third Wednesday of every month at 1:30.
Yeah, and we'll also be providing more information on this topic in our update at the end of the week, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll include links when I do a legislative update. I'll include links for people to see the full plan. And there's a very detailed graphic of step by step what's going to happen over the next 36 months. So we'll have that in there for you.
All right, great. All right, and then finally, Deena, revenue sharing. We've been talking a lot about revenue sharing, both from a budgetary standpoint, of course, with the governor's budget recommendations, where her recommendations came in at. Also, some of the activities surrounding creating a new trust fund. Then also, how is that trust fund going to be funded? So why don't you talk a little bit more about the trust fund, maybe some of the bills that have been introduced, where we stand on those bills, and what our thought process is on that.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So last year, and again, this legislative term, there's two different versions of creating this revenue sharing trust fund. And in both versions, what they have in common is a carve out of the state sales tax that would go into what we call a revenue sharing trust fund. And it would be a certain amount of money. That money would sit in that trust fund and then get appropriated out through the regular appropriations process. So each year the legislature would have to appropriate the money out of that fund. The reason that we like the idea of a revenue sharing trust fund is because it makes it intentional how much money is in there and is going to go out. It's not just based on a number that we've pulled out of the sky recommended, increase or decrease to our revenue sharing line items. In version 1, which is not our version, it is a flat dollar amount that will create the revenue sharing trust fund. That flat dollar amount will be based on this year's fiscal year 24 revenue sharing dollars that have been recommended and passed by the legislature. And that just creates a floor. It doesn't talk about how additional monies go in there. It just says this is what is in the floor, and then it can receive money from anywhere. Our version of the revenue sharing trust fund that we are working on, and Senator Kleinfeld is going to drop these bill drafts for us, I think yet this week, is going to carve out a percentage of the state sales tax. More than enough to cover what our current year fiscal year appropriation is. And then that revenue sharing trust fund will be funded by the increases and or decreases in the state's sales tax revenue. So in other words, if the revenue in sales tax grows, then the money in our trust fund will grow. If sales tax drops, then money in the revenue sharing trust fund would drop. I say that because revenue sharing was originally created to share in the state's revenue. That's why we're taking this approach. It is not just, oh, well, you're going to go off of revenue sharing for a while, or we're going to cut you here, even though we have increases in sales tax. So this is a little bit more reflective of what revenue sharing was originally meant to be. And it allows counties and cities, villages, and townships to realize the growth in the economy, because all of our other revenues are really stifled by the Headley Amendment and Proposal A and the interaction therein. So that's at least what we have in common, is the creation of the trust fund. The legislature wouldn't be able to take money out of it and transfer it somewhere else without actually changing the act. It's not just shuffling money around during the appropriations process. They would have to go back in, amend the law through both chambers, and get it signed by the governor that way. So we think it's a little bit more stable of a system and reflective of what it should be. The second piece of that legislation is the distribution of those funds. And so the versions that have been turned in now, like I said, have exactly what the appropriation is now. Okay, so on the city, village, and township side, it would be, and of course I don't have them in front of me, their fiscal year 24 appropriation amount and our fiscal year 24 appropriation amount. But there's a difference there where there's more money on the city, village, and township side than there is on the county side. And this is just statutory. We're not talking about the $1.1 billion in constitutional revenue sharing that we don't get. We're talking about statutory. So in our version, we're trying to, again, increase that total pot in the revenue sharing trust fund and split that pot equally amongst cities, villages, and townships and counties, 50-50. We each serve 100% of the population, although we have more mandates than they do. we would split that statutory side equally
And,
with
and
more
right now,
money. So it
and
would
right
be an
now the-
increase on both sides.
but right now the split is what, 60-40? They get 60, we get 40.
Yeah, it's right
Ballpark?
now it's about 57.5 to 46.5, whatever.
Okay.
53.5 to 47.5, whatever.
And,
46. There we go.
and our argument in that is that, hey, we are all serving the same population, right? We're all serving 100% of the population in state, counties are, and so are CVTs. Let's see that equitability there so that we can do what we are mandated to do in a lot of instances with those funds. So I think that's one important highlight. So to recap, you got the creation of a trust fund, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of step one. You got to fund the trust fund. There's differing ideas on how to do that, and then how do you distribute the trust fund? So kind of the three key points there, all different than how the way things are done, very different than the way things are done now. So I think, as we move through this process, there'll be a lot of moving parts, as there always is with legislation. So what are kind of the next steps, Deena? You talked a little bit about bills, some bills being introduced. Our bills have not been introduced. What's the, ultimate, game plan on this?
Well, I mean, really it boils down to how much money do you want, is the legislature willing to put into the trust fund? And then, sort of the distribution. So we have, bills that were turned in both the House and the Senate, on the other version, which is just that minimum base level. And then a split distribution, not an equal split distribution, but the current percentage split distribution. Our version would increase the amount of money into the revenue sharing trust fund significantly from where it is now, and split it equally. So it would be an increase on both sides. Our VRIP bills should be dropped in later this week. Again, Senator Veronica Kleinfeld from Macomb County, former MAC board chair, very well aware of of what's going on here, is going to drop hers in. She's already worked it out with Senator Moss that we're going to sit down in a work group and talk about really what our differences are, what the goals are, and where we can get on this legislation to find some common ground. So I expect that to happen about a week and a half after spring break. So mid to late April, we'll sit down and try and work those differences out.
Yeah, great. All right. And then finally, great work on that, Deena. That, something we've been working on for a while, and hopefully the creation of the fund at the very least will create some certainty going forward, assuming there is a very favorable funding mechanism put in there. So obviously something very important that'll make counties sleep better at night instead of waiting for the legislature to always appropriate those funds, pass a budget. Oftentimes there's a variability there, why there is a superficial, I guess you could call it, deadline that they have to be done by July 1st. There's really no penalty if it's not done by July 1st. So great job there. All right. And then finally, we have our conference coming up the end of April, April 24th through 26th here in Lansing. It's, of course, our 125th anniversary of the association, created in 1898. We have a great conference lineup. We will be having elections at this conference. So if you're interested in being on the MAC board, make sure you check out the legislative update each week. There's information on how to apply for any open board seats. The deadline to do that is this Friday, March 27th. They're holding up our mugs, our 125th anniversary hat. No, those are regular hats. I got to get some new hats, but
Swag purchase.
right. But conference
like those.
registration is open. We encourage you to please sign up. We'd like to have a great showing. We've invited the governor. We're working on getting her to come. We have legislative leaders that are going to be speaking. Folks from NACO will be there. So we've got a great group of people that are going to be there. Of course, you'll be getting an update from our staff. We'll have our annual legislative reception where all our legislators, we have a great showing for that. That'll be that conference as well. So hopefully you can attend. If there's ever any questions, you can contact our office and someone will be happy to answer any of those questions for you. So does anyone else have anything before we close today?
Go green.
Go green.
Go white. Yeah. Let's hopefully they get through another weekend. That's always fun. And then, then they're on the big stage. So, all right. Thanks everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.